You can't beat the eye of the tiger. What a great song. So I've got my shot of Jägermeister, and I'm ready for you. So we're going to talk about most startups fail within the first 24 months. And there are many things you can't control, market timing, macro conditions. But there are a bunch of mistakes that get repeated over and over again that I've witnessed in my life as a venture capitalist. And that's why I'm on stage today to talk to you about that. So I'm on the dark side of the force, I'm an evil investor. But I have spent a lot of time financing companies at the seed stage. So I was 10 years with Atlas. I did 25 seeds, about 15 Series A, probably put a bit over $100 million to work, generated close to $3 billion in enterprise value, and recently came back to Europe because I love Europe. I'm a convicted European, and so came back to Accel Partners in September. My best company, if you're from the UK, you probably know about, which is Zoopla, which I took from seed to IPO through 7 years. We did a £1 billion IPO in June, which was a really great and proud event. So to quote Stephen Gary Blank, as you know, startups are nothing more but an experiment at the beginning, a construct that is a search for a repeatable and scalable business model. And in the early days of a company, if I look back at Zoopla, for example, we knew where we wanted to be in 5 years, but we never wrote plans that went beyond 3 months, because we knew that any plan we wrote would not stand the test of reality. And you're constantly in this mode at the beginning of trying to find something that's both repeatable and scalable as a company. And these are very fragile times. And what I want to talk to you about today is how you mitigate risk in the most fragile moments of a company's life. I like to think, I forgot who first used this construct, but it's a good way to think about it. You can think of a startup as having 3 key assets, team, technology, and traction. And usually most companies will score highly on one of these dimensions, but they rarely will score highly on all 3. So for us as investors, we look for something exceptional on one of these axes that we can kind of hang our hat on. So if I look, for example, when I was in Boston, we backed a company called DataZoo, and DataZoo was a missile guidance technology. So their objective was to help missiles sort of follow moving objects with weather and wind. Ended up being a combinatorial math company. So that was an example of something that an incredible technology asset, but not much else attached to it except for a great CTO. And we thought, well, that's probably worth investing in, but we didn't quite know where to take it. And the answer ended up being real-time bidding and basically the optimization of advertising targeting, where you take hundreds of points of data and try and help you bid on the right advertising impression. So that's an example where this company scored super highly on tech, but had almost nothing else in terms of asset. And our job as investors was to sort of build out a team around it and show some reference customers so that we could sort of try and optimize the size of this triangle, these 3 T's, make the surface as wide as we could so we could take the company to Series A and raise some money. So it's a useful way that we like to think about companies. This graph, if you take a second, I want to help you understand how investors look at you, because if you understand how investors look at you, you'll be more ready to understand how you're going to get funded. So on the x-axis, you see the number of companies in a portfolio, 1, 10, 20, so number of companies we invest in. And on the y-axis, you see the return profile of each of these companies as a multiple of cash invested. So most people think they're on the blue line, which is your company is going to do maybe return the money, maybe return twice the money, and a few companies will return 5+ times the money. But this is actually, it's a very naive view of the world. It doesn't work that way. When I look back at all the funds that we have invested in and that were successful, you end up with very few companies with an extremely skewed return profile. And our job is really to put a bunch of companies in a portfolio and then try and concentrate capital in those few that have that skewed profile. So we're always looking for 2 things in the companies that we back. We're looking on the one hand for a glimmer of greatness, right? This notion of unlimited upside, which means a company can go to the moon and it sort of has no natural cap on how much it can be worth. But then we also need impact. And impact for a fund is the ability for us to put enough capital to work that we can have a real meaningful return that actually doesn't impact on the fund. So for example, it's more interesting to me to put $20 million in a company that's going to return 10 times the money than it is to put $1 million in a company that sells for 100 times the money. I know it sounds counterintuitive, but it's not about just the returns, it's about the returns and the ability to put enough capital to work. So if you look back at my company, Zoopla, we did the seed, I did the seed, the A, the B, and then I saw this company was a rocket ship, and I spent all my time talking to angels, talking to founder, and trying to find anybody who's willing to sell me shares, because it took very little capital to grow, and I wanted to make sure I had enough capital at work. So I ended up kind of eking my way up to about $14 million invested. It's a company that only took about 8 or 9 from operating capital, but because I wanted to make sure I had a real impact on the fund by the time we sold it. I want to get to $200 million back to my fund to have a real impact. So when you're a seed company, one of the things that frustrates the shit out of entrepreneurs, and I know it, is that they never understand what the rule is for raising the next round of funding. They come to us and they're like, well, do I need 50,000 users or 500,000 users? Do I need $10,000 in monthly revenue or $200,000 in monthly revenue? And they're looking for rules that will help say, oh, I'm ready to raise my Series A. But actually, we don't really think that way because we're constantly evaluating risk. And we look at signal in the form of, again, team technology and traction. And we're constantly trying to look at the profile of a company to say, we think these guys are ready for the next round. And so that's why these rules are fluid. And you have to add to that you're in a race with hundreds of other startups who are also making progress. So we're constantly reevaluating how we think about you. And it's also important to remember that, in my words, investing in a startup is like an act of love. At some point, you fall in love with a project. You really have a sort of emotional attachment to a project. And then to make sure you don't invest in stupid ideas, you kind of rationalize your way back. You try and be very rigorous about how you think about an investment opportunity. But it ends up being, a sort of emotional bond that you create with an entrepreneur and with a company. The other thing to think about is that we ultimately need to see scalability and repeatability. And the best companies are built with very simple products and highly repeatable systems. When you're the founder of Salesforce and you're an exceptional sales guy, you can sell ice to Eskimos. Any founder worth their weight in salt is going to get the first 5 or 10 customers, is going to get the first sales. But that's not what the battle is about. The battle is about your 17th sales hire being able to sell the product as well as you do, right? You have to build systems and repeatability in a company that help us get the belief that we can really scale a company highly. And sometimes proving scalability is more important than having an absolute revenue number. So I invested in a company called Secret Escapes, which is a private travel sales, and after we did the seed and the A, we had very little revenue, we were losing a lot of money, but our first cohorts, that were 7, 9, 10-month old had started to become profitable. And Index Ventures looked at this thing and said, oh, we have repeatability here in the cohorts, and they were able to raise a really significant Series B at a fairly high valuation because they'd proven that the model worked, even though they looked like they were in the red and burning a lot of money. So repeatability and scalability are really what matters. So every startup has got some kind of DNA, and your DNA could be very engineering focused, or you could be 2 business guys who don't really understand the complexity of technology. But whatever your DNA is as a founding team, you absolutely have to get as far away from it as you can and complement your skills and where you test yourself with the things that you're not comfortable with. So Stephen Gary Blank will say, you need to get out of the building. The classic example, especially for European technology companies, will be the technical founders who think they're really testing market by doing A/B testing on landing pages. But the reality is you may not be really testing yourself against market reality when you do that. There's a guy I know, again in Boston, called Hugh Crean, who was the founder of Faircast. And what Hugh would do whenever he had a new business concept is he would go to Starbucks, and every morning for 2 weeks, he would buy coffee to someone. He would say, I want to run an investment idea past you, or a startup idea past you, and see what you think. And before he had committed a line of code, before he had done functional drawings of his app or whatever it may be, he just went out there and tested a concept against real people to see whether, from a cognitive standpoint, they get it, to see whether they were reacting positively. And before spending any time, any money, before having built a company that becomes an anchor around his neck, he would go test these things without spending any cash. Now, was it comfortable to go to strangers and talk to them about a concept? It wasn't, but it's the kind of thing you need to do. So these are kind of preamble to set the stage and talk about the core here, which is what are things within your control as an entrepreneur that are likely to kill you? And they always belong to the same categories that have to do with talent, time, choices, and cash. So let's kind of run through that. So I always say defeat starts at home. Most startups die because of internal issues, and these internal issues have to do with who they have as co-founders, who they hire early in the team, who they have as early investors. There is a professor at Harvard called Noam Wasserman who spent most of his career talking about early startup failures. And what he found was the number one mistake people do, so about 2/3 of startups fail because of people issues, according to his research. The number one mistake people do is they start a company with people with whom they're socially close, and that ends up killing them. So it's not because you get along with your best friend from school that is the right co-founder. It's not, you should really think hard about starting a business with your brother. People have the notion that, because you know people socially, because you may have worked with them in a different job, that you're going to be a perfect pair of co-founders, and it's a very dangerous thing to do. It's actually very often better to go out to interview 40, 50 people, find a technology co-founder with whom you get along, get to know each other over 6 months, and then start a company together. A related issue that people make, or a mistake that people make, is they lock in the equity too early. Now, in the US, very famously, the Zipcar co-founder, there were 2 women, and one of them had a baby and then realized startup life was really hard, and she walked away with 50% of the company, and never showed up for work again, leaving the other person with a damaged cap table and a fair amount of loneliness, right? The other thing that will kill you is bad investors and a bad board. There is a saying in Silicon Valley that a bad board kills a company every time. So if you have investors who are overly involved in your operations, that's a bad sign. If you have investors who are shaky within their venture partnership and are nervous about failure, and that shakiness starts to impact how they think about your company, that's a bad sign. If you have angel investors who know fuck all about the tech you're building, but are really concerned about you losing their cash, that's a bad sign. So you really want to watch carefully who you allow to come into your precious baby. This is not a game. The early days of a startup are critical. If you find your co-founder is not the right person, you're going to have to make that early decision to either change their role and take away whatever C title you gave them, or fire them and find someone else. And it's really hard to do because you start with this idealistic view that you're there to build a business and that you're a loving person and you want to create a great culture. The reality is, if you let people in the company at the beginning who are not the right people, you're likely to die, right? And as a related issue, your first hires are super important. So the best companies I've seen will find awesome mathematicians out of Romania and people like that that are incredible, and they spend a lot of time finding these A+ talent, and A+ talent attracts A+ talent. If you hire average people at the beginning, you're doomed. So think about talent. The other thing that really screws people up is time, because when you raise a seed round, you think you've got all the time in the world and you've got this perfect plan in your head. I'm going to recruit, I'm going to launch, I'm going to get metrics, I'm going to go out to Series A with fantastic metrics. What a great plan. And then, reality hits you in the face, and then you go, oh shit, I hired the wrong set of engineers. I thought they were great at Android. Turns out they're .NET guys, and I had no clue what I was doing. And then you start to scale, and you realize, I used some kind of graph database, but now I need to index 1 billion profiles, and it doesn't work, and I need another graph database. And then you're re-engineering your backend. And then, instead of going out with beautiful metrics, you're just launching your product, and then you come and see me, and you're like, we launched 2 weeks ago. I'm like, well, that's great. Let's see in 3 months where your metrics are, and you're screwed, right? So now you're fighting for survival because you didn't anticipate the impact of time. You weren't realistic about all the shit that goes wrong in startups. The other thing you need to think about is how you beat the crunch. Because back in the old days, it was kind of comfortable. You'd say, I got a great seed idea, I'm going to raise $1 million, and then I'm going to go in a room, in a basement, I'm going to build a product, and then I'll go out to venture capitalists, and I'll raise 4 million or 6 million Series A with a product that hasn't been launched. Well, these days it doesn't work like that, because if you go on angel lists today, you'll see these hundreds of great startups that have a lot of traction, that they built on very little money. So this distributed innovation is fantastic, but you're fighting with thousands of entrepreneurs running really fast. And so you got to think about ways to beat the crunch, right? You got to maybe use a Kickstarter campaign, maybe raise a bit of money on angel lists, and just be ready for the fact that that Series A bar kind of keeps moving. Every time you get closer, it moves because other people have made progress as well. The founder of Viagogo, Danae Ringelmann, has a great story around this, around how her sense of mission allowed her to keep going through 3 years of not being able to raise any money because she believed in the project. And so what you don't want to do is a mistake a lot of people make, is they say, well, I can't do anything anymore, I don't have any money. You can't wait for the money. The money will come when you've made the progress, right? Like get it the right way around. Now, the hardest thing as an entrepreneur is that you have to make decisions in conditions of uncertainty. You have imperfect data or no data at all, yet it is your job to make hard decisions about where the company go. Number one. Number two, you're the only person who can define the mission for the company ultimately, and you will own that. So you make decisions about where the company goes, you define the mission, and then you make sure that you're moving the ball down the field every day. Alex Chesterman at Zoopla, who's the most phenomenal entrepreneur I've worked with, never showed up at a conference, never gave talks to journalists about what it was like to be an entrepreneur or anything like that. Every day, he was doing something meaningful for Zoopla, every day of the week. And that's really your job. Again, this is not a game. Don't bask in the glory of you've raised $1.5 million and you're on TechCrunch. Because if you take your eye off the ball, you're going to end up 5 years later with no money and feeling like a schmuck. This is not a dress rehearsal. So I think fundamentally you sort of have to accept that you live in a world of chaos as an entrepreneur, and you just have to say, time, talent, a lot of things will go wrong. Like Ben Horowitz says, you're halfway between elation and absolute terror, and the more you can accept chaos and uncertainty, the better off you will be. And then I put this little acronym that says, cash is more important than your mother. Ultimately, the only thing that really kills a startup is running out of cash, right? It sounds obvious, but I cannot tell you how many times I've had founders who are so busy working and executing that they forget to raise their head and look 6 months out and say, oh my God, I'm running out of cash. And they're so busy trying to make progress that they forget to think about what's going to happen when they hit the wall. So your primary job is to make sure you can pay the salaries and you can keep the lights on, and you have to know where you're going. If you find out you're running out of cash the month you're running out of cash, you're dead. It's a very uplifting presentation. No, but I'm here to tell you what it's really like to build them, because I've seen too many fail, and I love my entrepreneurs, and I don't want you to be in the same boat. Ultimately, it all comes down to focus. Focus is a very scary thing, because it means you're going to take your organization, which has a myriad of possibilities and a million things that it can do, and you're going to say, I will do only that. Right? You will limit your freedom of choices to do one thing and bet the farm. But that's how you become successful. Once you focus, everything becomes simple. Who you hire, how you go to market, what you execute on. Supercell, which is an Accel company, when I talked to Kevin Comolli about what made Ilky so successful, he said the guy is insanely focused. So they started doing browser games, and they were doing fine. And then Ilky said, you know what, screw that. We're going to do tablet first, mid-core MMOG, and nothing else. Today, it looks obvious. At the time, it wasn't. The whole board told him it was crazy. I think his wife was nervous, too. But that's all they did. And to this day, they do no merchandising, no derivative media, nothing except for mid-core browser games on tablets. And look at what the company's become, because he was insanely focused. So I'm going to stop it here. I think what I'm trying to tell you is there are a number of mistakes that people make repeatedly that actually within your power to influence, and it's your job to think about how you're going to live in these conditions of chaos, uncertainty, and hyper-competition to be successful. So we have 4 minutes left, time for some Q&A. I'm extremely open and honest, so I'll try and give you very direct answers if you want to throw some questions at me.
Well, first of all, thanks for a great talk. So we have both questions possible from slide on the app, and if you have the traditional way questions, just raise your hands.
All right, so top question. As EU startup that wants to succeed globally, do you have to get out of the continent? 2 answers to that. So if you're a Croatian startup and you sold to RTL Croatia to your buddy from business school, that's unlikely to be the same quality of reference as if you've sold to RTL Luxembourg and you were in front of the CTO. So it's unfortunate, but it's the reality. You have to think about referenceability and competition in a global way. Point number 2, the best competition is usually in the US, increasingly in Asia. You want to go hit the best competition head on. Competition is your friend because it's going to make you better. If you want to succeed globally, I think there are companies that are very legitimate local successes. You know, Zoopla is a $1.6 billion company, UK only. I would say that the faster you get out of your comfort zone from a geographic standpoint, the better off you are. The other thing is you got to think about who's going to acquire you, because unfortunately, if you build in Warsaw and your entire company is built in Warsaw, it's going to be really hard to be acquired. If you have a tech team in Warsaw and your business development center in New York, Boston, San Francisco, or London, you know, your chances of being acquired are much higher. Number 2, which is most important when raising money? Team, traction, technology. You are not paying attention. A mixture of the 3. It's the surface area. It depends. There are some companies that will raise on technology alone. They're few and far between. In general, if I had to pick one, it would be team. It is always about who's the entrepreneur you're backing. And I want people who scare me a little. You know, I want people who are like friendly and engaging and self-aware, but at some point I want them to go, I'm going to own this market by doing X, Y, and Z, and I want to be a little bit scared by the level of intent. And you know, this is something where the European entrepreneurs don't rank highly because you want to be liked. The Americans want to kick the shit out of you, and you want to be loved. And you know, this is where you want to know what market you want to own and go and express that in a clear way. When should you start scaling a company? That's a fantastic question. So as investors, we're kind of schizophrenic, right? Because at the beginning, we're like, spend as little as you can, spend as little as you can. When we see that things are repeatable and work, it's like, boom, you know, let's put $50 million in the engine and grow big. Like we just put $100 million into BlaBlaCar to kind of take them global. In general, I think, statistically, I think most companies try to scale too early. So I would err on the side of wait a bit longer. You always think it's a sprint, it's always a marathon. You want to start scaling when you know you have repeatable systems. So in other words, you hired 5 sales guys, you fired 1, 3 of them are on quota after 90 days, you're starting to see that you have repeatability in your sales engine, you may be ready for scale. You want to absolutely watch out for false positives. You've had 3 great sales into hedge funds. You think you get a hedge fund business. They're actually false positives because you sold to very early adopters. So it's a mixture of making sure that you're finding repeatability and then making sure that you're getting proper signal from the market. When raising a seed round, how long does it take? I don't know. How long is a piece of string? When I introduced Newscred on AngelList and they went to New York, they were a Geneva-based company, they raised in 2 weeks because they had, I think Roger Ehrenberg at IA Capital Ventures said, I love these guys, I'm going to put them on my back, and their round accelerated. I think when you're raising a seed round, it's a really good idea to do rolling closes. So in other words, you get 250K committed from a bunch of people. You say, you guys happy that we close? You close, you leave the round open, and you keep adding $50,000 checks. And you know, you're in control of the process, you keep pouring money into it. You don't say, I'm going to raise 750, you get to 500, everybody feels like you failed. Whereas in reality, if you said, I'm raising 300, you get to 500, everybody thinks you're great, you get to 750, people are like, wow, it's oversubscribed. right? So I think that's the way I would do it.
Fred, unfortunately, we're out of time. We take maybe one more questions. That's an interesting one. Do accelerators help or hinder startups?
I mean, I've been a mentor and investor in Techstars Boston, which I've seen do fantastic work around some companies. I've also seen some absolutely horrible mentoring. So I think accelerators are only as good as the quality of the network around it. I think everything else is poetry, you know, desks and whatever. It's like, it's all very useful, but it's sort of by the by. Y Combinator, by the way, is no offices and no desks and no infrastructure. It's all about the network. So I think you can sustain, in Europe, probably a few high-quality accelerators. I don't think we can have 50 of them, because there's actually a limited supply of great mentors and people are going to be meaningful to you. So I think the right accelerators will do a great job, but I don't think accelerators are some kind of magical mechanism by which you can help companies. On that note, thank you very much, and have a great day, guys.
Give it up for Fred.